So, the Leveson report has damned the press and divided the politicians in equal measure. Whilst defending a free press as a true safeguard to our democracy, Lord Justice Leveson said the papers had the power to wreak havoc in the lives of innocent people. To curb that, he wants a press body that must be genuinely independent but still remains self-regulatory. Although its members should include people with experience of the industry, the majority should be independent of it and should not include any serving editor or MP. Newspapers will be given incentives to join up as members, facing potentially lower costs in any court case. But he says it is essential that there should be legislation to underpin the system, to enshrine for the first time a legal duty on the government to protect press freedom, to reassure the public that basic requirements of independence and effectiveness would be met, and to validate the body's standards code and system of arbitration. But, as our political editor Gary Gibbon now reports, Leveson's call for statutory underpinning of the planned regulator has divided MPs down the middle.
The judge asked to come up with a new way to regulate the newspapers, produced an answer David Cameron didn't like. Lord Justice Leveson says the body that regulates newspapers, their ethics and apologies, can't be run by newspapers alone anymore. It needs to be more independent and overseen by a government watchdog, Ofcom.
This is not and cannot reasonably or fairly be characterised as statutory regulation of the press. I am proposing independent regulation of the press organised by the press.
But David Cameron said the judge had got it wrong. Laws controlling newspapers can mushroom into censorship. He said he wanted changes to the way newspapers regulate themselves, but not new laws.
The issue of principle is that for the first time we would have crossed the Rubicon of writing elements of press regulation into the law of the land. We should, I believe, be wary of any legislation that has the potential to infringe free speech and a free press.
This evening, all three main party leaders met to discuss how to move ahead on press regulation, but those talks don't look like going very far. Ed Miliband agrees thoroughly with the Leveson recommendations, and Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, said he agreed with the bulk of them as well. He did it in a separate statement, unusually, just after David Cameron's. And both those party leaders have quite a few Tory MPs on side, so together they could at some point defeat the Prime Minister potentially on press regulation. But their chances of actually passing a law in the teeth of the opposition of a Prime Minister are pretty remote.
I believe that the case for legislation has been made, but of course acknowledge that we now need to show that how that can be delivered in a proportionate and workable way in practice. The Prime Minister, I hesitate to recap what he has said while he's sitting next to me, but has expressed his serious misgivings thoughtfully about the step of taking legislation.
Describing the phone hacking and other intrusions suffered by innocent victims like Millie Dowler, Lord Justice Leveson's report depicted a press that was out of control, showed significant and reckless disregard for accuracy, would resist or dismiss complainants almost as a matter of course, and showed a recklessness in prioritising sensational stories almost irrespective of the harm caused, heedless of the public interest. The victims' groups welcomed the criticism and the conclusions from Lord Justice Leveson, and they reminded David Cameron that he'd said their protection should be the test of any new rules.
Are we really protecting people who've been caught up and absolutely thrown to the wolves by this process? That's what the test is.
He called it the victim test. He called it the Dowler test. It looks like he failed his own test. He appointed a Lord Justice to make recommendations, and now he says he's not going to follow them. That's a failure of that test. Maybe he needs to resit.
I do not want to live in a country where innocent families like the McCanns and the Dowlers can see their lives torn apart simply for the sake of profit. And where powerful interests in the press know they won't be held to account. This is about the character of our country.
Lord Justice Leveson said the relationship between politicians and the press had been too cosy and made the public think favours were being exchanged. But after extensive grilling of the former Culture Secretary Jeremy Hunt, Lord Justice Leveson cleared him of any impropriety in his overseeing of the B-Sky B bid.
Good morning, Mr Murdoch. Any thoughts on the Leveson today?
Rupert Murdoch in New York today. The judge also said there was no evidence to support allegations that there was a grand bargain between the Tory leadership and the Murdochs, exchanging newspaper support for policies ahead of the last election.
But at the end of his report, Lord Justice Leveson seems to strike a very different note, and he seems to have David Cameron in his sights. He quotes Sir John Major, former Tory Prime Minister, saying that no one party must break off against the recommended changes on press regulation, trying to seek favour with powerful proprietors and press barons by opposing the recommendations.
This is the 7th time in less than 70 years that these issues have been addressed. No one can think that it makes any sense to contemplate an 8th.
As he left the stage, a reporter called out, "Did you enjoy that?"
Enjoyed it, Sir Brian.
A shrug, and he was off. Lord Justice Leveson said he was now passing the ball on to the politicians. They are far from agreed what they want to do with it.
Well, we're joined now by the Culture, Media and Sport Secretary, Maria Miller. Secretary of State, Mr Cameron set his own test, the Dowler test. And in the words of the Dowler family lawyer, he's failed his own test.
Look, let's be absolutely clear. The government today has accepted in full the Leveson principles, and what we're doing is now we're moving forward to see how we take those principles and put them into practice.
In full, excluding the law, which is the absolute cardinal element of this report.
In full, so that we have the sort of independent regulation that will mean that the victims who have been so affected by events of recent years can be assured that these sorts of things wouldn't happen again. So the sort of independent code, the sort of ability to be able to fine organisations that do the wrong thing, and also to make sure that people make amends as well.
But you're leaving out what Lord Leveson said. He said there needs to be a law to validate this.
When we look at the practical way we start to implement the recommendations, that's where we feel there are some questions to be asked. It's not just around the way a statutory regulation might work, but actually there's some really serious questions to be asked around things like data protection, how that might work, indeed how the role of Ofcom might work as well.
But you keep saying that you've embraced the whole of Leveson, but Leveson said it was essential that there should be a law. After all, you've trusted the press before. 8 times there have been investigations into the press by royal commissions and the rest. And now you're leaving it up to the press again to sort this out with no legal underpinning of any description.
Well, yes, we have grave concerns about whether legal underpinning is absolutely necessary for what Lord Leveson is talking about here. But let's also be clear, it's Lord Leveson who is now saying the ball is very much in the court of the press. They need to come forward with recommendations for an independent self-regulatory body that actually addresses the principles that he set out. But yes, we have grave concerns, and that's why tonight we've started cross-party talks to talk about those practical implementation issues. And I'm glad to say those talks went well. We'll be having further talks early next week to make sure that we go down into this detail.
Do you believe the judge when he says, and he went out of his way to say this would not be statutory regulation?
I think that he is drawing a really important definition between what might be wholesale statutory regulation of the press and statutory underpinning. I think the concern...
So all this crossing of the Rubicon, which the Prime Minister talks about, is sort of alarmist talk, isn't it?
The concern that we have is once you start to put in place that statutory underpinning, that you can very quickly get into a piece of legislation which could do so much more. And that's why, as part of our cross-party talks, we've already said that we will be putting forward a draft bill for consideration too, so that the other parties can see the sort of problems we're concerned about. But let's not get away from it here. The government and David Cameron set out very clearly that we are accepting in full the principles set out by Leveson. And yes, we do have concerns here, but we believe those concerns can be addressed.
Are you not forgetting the victims? I mean, after all, the judge said these people were the victims of outrageous, reckless misbehaviour. And they have embraced everything Leveson said. This report was all about them. The Prime Minister said it was all about them. They want the law. As one voice they want the law. And you're rejecting them.
And as I said up front, we're absolutely accepting in full the principles set out in Leveson for exactly that reason, because we know that the status quo is not an option. And we will be working with the opposition parties on making sure that we get that detail right as we move forward. People wouldn't expect to have a knee-jerk reaction from a government today. They'd expect us to work through the detail
well, there wasn't
to
a
make
knee-jerk reaction. There was an immediate no from the Prime Minister, effectively, to law.
No, what we said was we need to work through the detail to make sure that this would work in practice, and I think that's what people would expect us to do.
Secretary of State, thank you very much for coming in.